So I've got a theory about the third secret of Fatima, and I've never heard another one like it, which is surprising to me because it seems like the most obvious interpretation when you just take all of the source material and put it together. So I thought I'd make a video about it, maybe get some people talking, or at least give you an entertaining doomsday prophecy. I'm not going to go over the basics, so if you're not already familiar with Fatima and the third secret, you might want to go watch something else. Or if you're really curious, I wrote a 200-page report on it. I'll put a link in the description. Or you can use the timestamps in the description to skip to the end of the video for a quick summary of the doomsday part. Okay, so we all know that the third secret has two elements. There's the spiritual chastisement and the material chastisement. The spiritual chastisement was Vatican II, and everything that followed from it. That should be pretty obvious at this point. A lot of people have talked about that. The material chastisement, on the other hand, the annihilation of nations, not a whole lot has been said about that. Really, the only ones who have read the secret and spoken much about it were Lucy herself and Father Malachi Martin. So we're going to just go over what they've said and see what we can glean from it as we go. We'll start with Lucy. Technically her religious name was Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart, but I'm just going to call her Lucy. Now, you may not have heard about this, but back in 2013, the Carmel at Coimbra, the cloister where she lived, released a biography of her written by her fellow sisters called A Pathway Under the Gaze of Mary. You can find it on Amazon, I'll put a link in the description. That included some pages from her autobiography, My Path, otherwise known as her diary. That diary's never been seen before, it's kept at the Carmel and only they have access to it. And one of the entries they included was the story of how she wrote down the third secret. We already knew the basic story. We knew that she was having trouble writing it down and that Our Lady had to give her a special grace in order to be able to do it. But what we didn't know is that when she received that grace, she had a vision, and that vision was clearly of the material chastisement. There is nothing else that it could be. Now, the Carmel has been, let's say, subject to some suspicion by many Fatima scholars, and not without good reason, so you may question the authenticity of this diary entry. But what they usually do is that they downplay the sensational aspects of the apparition. And in fact, they did leave out all the stuff about Lucy fighting to get the consecration done. They even threw in a complete non sequitur right after the vision, where they suddenly start talking about how the third secret has been totally released, and Lucy said so, and they even bring up that fake interview that Cardinal Bertone did, which Bertone himself discredited live on national television back in 2007.
Che è larga 9 centimetri, come hanno scritto diversi autori.
Yet at the same time on the page before, they have a footnote that actually points out that the Bertone interview disagrees with the diary entry they just showed, where the Mother of God explicitly tells Lucy to write 1960 on the front of the envelope. They don't draw any conclusions from it. They don't say that it discredits the Bertone interview or try to give some kind of hand-wavy explanation as to why they disagree. It just points it out. So it seems like there's conflicting forces at work here. Like they know they have to toe the party line, but they're still trying to subtly get the truth out. The fact that an official Fatima publication would include a vision like this at all is already at odds with their usual MO, which might lead you to suspect that this is a fake vision and they're trying to mislead people for some reason. But if that was the case, I would expect it to be more sensational, or at least more detailed. Fortunately for us, they anticipated this, and they included a scan of the original Portuguese handwritten diary entry. This is, I think, one of 2 diary pages in the entire book that they bothered scanning. So clearly somebody understood what they were sitting on here, and wanted to share it in a way that was verifiable. If they were going to fabricate a vision, they would not have volunteered this scan, because they know that we have done forensic analysis of Lucy's handwriting before, looking for those very kind of shenanigans. So as far as I'm concerned, this is totally canon. This is Word of God when it comes to Fatima analysis now. So let's get right into it. This is her description of the vision she had January 3rd, 1944. Let's cue some ominous music. The tip of the spear as a flame unlatches and touches the axis of the earth. It shudders. Mountains, cities, towns, and villages with their inhabitants are buried. The sea, the rivers, and the clouds emerge from their limits, overflowing and bringing with them in a whirlwind houses and people in numbers that are not possible to count. It is the purification of the world because of sin as it plunges. Hatred and ambition cause the destructive war. Then I felt the rapid beating of my heart, and in my mind the echo of a gentle voice saying, "In time, one faith, one baptism, one church, holy, Catholic, apostolic, in eternity, heaven." So when I first read that, I thought, okay, earthquakes and floods, sure. It didn't sound that impressive. I mean, that's really basic wrath of God stuff that you would hear in any prophecy. And I think that's how most people reacted to it, and that's why there hasn't been much talk about it. And I think that might be how it got released in the first place. Maybe whoever was assigned to go through this and remove or avoid the sensational stuff didn't really think about this, because when you examine it carefully, in the light of everything else we know, it actually narrows down the possibilities for what the third secret could be by a surprising amount. Now, before we begin analyzing it, the first thing we have to decide is whether or not this vision is figurative or literal, and if it's figurative, to what degree. The furthest extreme would be completely abstract symbolism, like, for example, if the axis of the Earth symbolized the ideology on which modern civilization operates, and the earthquakes symbolize social upheaval, and the floods symbolize primordial chaos overtaking the hearts of men. That allegorical, almost artsy kind of interpretation, similar to how the Vatican tried to interpret the vision of the bishop in white. So how can we determine whether or not this is symbolic? Well, one approach is to look at prophetic visions in Scripture. Has God ever used that kind of wildly abstract language before? And the answer is yes, he has. But it's always really obvious when he does it. The most relevant example I can think of offhand is Daniel 7, the vision of the four beasts. First he sees a lioness with eagle wings, then a bear with 3 rows in its teeth, then a leopard with 4 heads, etc. That's a really obvious example of symbolism. Nobody would interpret that as meaning 4 mutant beasts are going to appear on Earth. And to make it more clear, the angel explains immediately afterwards that each of the beasts symbolizes a kingdom, and that their attributes symbolize attributes of those kingdoms. Another example is Apocalypse 12, the dragon who chases the woman and her child around, and the dragon belches out a river, and the earth opens up and swallows the river. Again, obviously not a prophecy of a river-belching dragon invading the earth. Lucy's vision, on the other hand, can easily be taken literally. And yes, there are parts of Apocalypse that you could interpret literally, but the book establishes its abstract motif early on. Moreover, while the scriptural visions were given to the church to meditate on for millennia, Lucy's vision, unlike the third secret text, was not intended for the public. It was just something for her to give her strength to write down the secret that very night. So you would think she understood what she was seeing, and that's probably the very reason that Our Lady doesn't explain it, because it was a clear visual depiction of what she had already been told in the third secret. But there's a less abstract kind of figurative language, let's call it representation or simplification. Say you wanted to visually convey something that isn't visible, like magnetism. You could show it by its literal effects, but that wouldn't convey what's actually causing those effects. So instead you could do, maybe like on a TV show, you could see little wavy lines representing the magnetic fields. Or if you wanted to show something complicated, say like a series of political events leading up to a war, you could simplify that and just show 2 world leaders yelling at each other in some kind of visual exchange, maybe standing over a map. I mean, that's not wildly abstract, but it is symbolic. You follow me? So I can't think of any scriptural examples offhand that do that. So let's approach this from another angle then. What about the other visions of Fatima? Did any of them use figurative language? The first one was the vision of hell. You may remember Our Lady shone light on the ground, and it opened up, and the children saw hell, and they saw it as a sea of fire with flaming souls, like transparent embers, all blackened and burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration. Now some might say that this has to be symbolic because hell is not a physical place with fire and brimstone, to which I would reply you need a refresher on your catechism because hell is totally a physical place. We don't know where exactly. People have come up with various theories over the centuries, the center of the Earth, or another dimension, or Mars. But wherever it is, we know that it's a physical place because, at the end of time, everyone will be raised from the dead, and the damned will take their bodies with them back to hell to be tormented physically as well as spiritually, and if physical bodies can exist there, then it must be a physical place. The only other element of the vision that one might object to as being symbolic was the depiction of demons with the likeness of animals, black and transparent like burning coals. While it's true that demons have no physical bodies by nature, they can take visible form even here on Earth. And Gabriel Amorth, the late chief exorcist of Rome, testifies that shadows and beasts are among those that they've been known to use. So ultimately there's really no way of knowing whether this vision was literal or a representation, but the fact that Lucy thought they would have died of terror had Our Lady not promised that they would go to heaven beforehand, I think lends itself more toward a literal interpretation. The next one is a vision that Jacinta had in the fields. She said, "I saw the Holy Father in a very big house, kneeling by a table, with his head buried in his hands, and he was weeping. Outside the house there were many people, some of them were throwing stones, others were cursing him and using bad language. If this is a pope that's already passed, then this was obviously not literal, unless there was an instance of a pope being stoned by a mob that I'm unaware of. But even if this event hasn't happened yet, it's hard to picture a pope sitting in a big house with an angry mob literally right outside throwing rocks. Not impossible, it just, I think, lends itself more toward a figurative interpretation. In which case it would be an example of simplification. It's taking a complicated political situation and conveying the essence of it briefly in one very easy-to-understand image. Next was the theophany at Tui, and I'll just put a picture of this up on the screen so I don't have to describe it to you. Basically, Lucy saw this, and she said it was a representation of the mystery of the Holy Trinity, sort of like how Jacob's Ladder represented the relationship between God and men through Christ. Obviously, that has to be symbolic, because the literal reality of it cannot be conveyed in any material way, so that one kind of doesn't count. The last vision, of course, is the Bishop in White. It opens with an angel trying to set the world on fire with a flaming sword, and Our Lady extinguishing the flames with light radiating from her hand. Then the angel cries, "Penance, penance, penance." Now, that could be a thing that literally happens in a metaphysical sense, but it's probably a bit of representative drama meant to show us the dynamic of Our Lady's intercession protecting us from divine punishment. It's not symbolic. We're not saying the fire represents Hitler and the light represents the Allied forces or anything crazy like that. It means what it shows. It's just not necessarily something that literally happens the way we're seeing it. After that, we have the Bishop in White walking through a ruined city, stepping over corpses with trembling steps and a look of pain, climbing a steep mountain with a cross on top, and finally being executed on his knees, along with other bishops, priests, brothers, and nuns, by a group of soldiers using bullets and arrows. As with the first half of the vision, it's possible that this is a literal scene that will take place, but Islamic militant groups do still use arrows sometimes, but it's only if bullets are scarce, and I can't imagine them being used for a high-profile execution. Nor would I expect anyone to march the Pope/anti-Pope, whichever one he is, up a mountain, with an entourage that just happens to be representative of the whole clergy, and kill him in front of a rough cross. That's the sort of thing you do with a little bit more pomp. Like the first half of the vision, this is probably a representative drama or an abridgment of what will happen. There will be a city that gets destroyed, probably Rome, and this Bishop in White will be killed by a military force, but the scene we're presented with is probably not taken straight from history. Besides, in a letter dated May 12, 1982, Lucy did call the part of the secret that refers to the annihilation of nations a symbolic revelation, so there's got to be something non-literal to it. I know there's some controversy around that letter, I just thought I'd mention it. So given that the only two visions that depict future events look pretty figurative, for the sake of this discussion we're going to allow for the possibility that some of the elements of this vision of the tip of the spear are not historical, but we're going to assume that the gist of the vision is literal. Okay, now we can finally talk about this. First of all, are we talking about one single big event where there is earthquakes, floods, whatever it is with the clouds, and war, or are we talking about separate things? The vision strongly indicates that it's the tip of the spear that causes the earthquakes by striking the axis. The planet trembles immediately after it's hit, and then we're shown earthquakes in 4 types of locations: mountains, cities, towns, and villages. These settings are all most likely having the quakes at the same time, I think. But if we take a less literal interpretation of the spear, it's possible that they're separate quakes, but I'd think they'd still have to be occurring within a short period of time to be presented this way. Now, logically, earthquakes create tsunamis, which would give rise to the subsequent flooding, so it seems like these first 3 parts play out in sequence: spear, earthquake, flood. A war is brought up, but Lucy doesn't describe anything visibly showing the war, she just references it. And she calls it the war, not a war, which leads me to believe that the war she mentions is the context in which the preceding events are taking place, or that they themselves mark the beginning of that war, perhaps the same war that yields the ruined city and the dead clergy and the soldiers in the vision of the Bishop in White. At this point I should probably mention that the version I just read is from the official English translation of A Pathway Under the Gaze of Mary. I try not to put all my trust in official translations though, so I have some alternate ones here as well. A couple of auto-generated ones from Google, and 2 based on Antonio Socci's Italian translation. The differences are actually really minor. In one they have lance instead of spear, and vortex instead of whirlwind, and various verbs describing the people being carried away. The most significant difference is the description of the war. In the auto-generated cases, it doesn't say the war, it just says it causes war. That's probably the more literal translation, but because both human translations put in the word the, it's possible that the is implied by some Portuguese grammar rule. In both cases, it's a singular war. It's just, if you call it the war, it's possible you're referring to something that you've already referred to. Whereas if she just says destructive war breaks out, it's probably something developing in the present rather than something that existed in the past. So, tip of the spear. What is it? Well, first, let's frame this whole event in the context of something we know from Lucy's other letters and interviews. And it's something that I've forgotten a number of times over the years and had to remind myself of. I think a lot of other people forget about it too. She said that Russia will be the instrument of the chastisement. In the 1957 Fuentes interview, she said that specifically while talking about the material chastisement. Some people don't think the Fuentes interview is authentic, but she said the same thing in two letters, one from February 28, 1943 to Bishop Feria, where she says, "If not, she will again be the enemy through which God will chastise them once more," and in a May 4th, 1943 letter to Father Goncalves, "If the bishops of Spain do not attend to his wishes, it will be once more the scourge with which God punishes them." And even if you don't accept any of that, Malachi Martin confirmed the same thing in a December 1991 interview with Steel on Steel.
What about this scenario, okay? Because part of the message to Lucy, the visionary, was that Russia would be the instrument of the heaven's chastisements of the world.
Right.
So
He may have been referencing the Fuentes interview, but at the very least that has to mean that the contents of The Secret don't contradict this. Because remember, he read The Secret. If it contradicted that interview, he would have known the interview was fake, and wouldn't have repeated something from it. And if that passing confirmation was too casual for you, he strongly implies the same thing in his book, Keys of This Blood. Lucia's single-page written formation of the Third Secret covers three main topics. A physical chastisement of the nations involving catastrophes man-made or natural, on land, on water, and in the atmosphere of the globe. A spiritual chastisement, far more frightening and distressing, especially for Roman Catholics, than physical hardship, since it would consist of the disappearance of religious belief, a period of widespread unfaith in many countries. And a central function of Russia in the two preceding series of events. In fact, the physical and spiritual chastisements, according to Lucia's letter, are to be gridded on a fateful timetable in which Russia is the ratchet. Russia, according to the text of the Third Secret, was the regulator of the timetable. I'm putting so much emphasis on this because it really narrows down the possibilities of what the chastisement can be. If Russia is the instrument, then it has to be something that Russia can cause. We're not talking about the errors of Russia spreading and making the world sin, and the sin calling down punishment. That would make them a kind of indirect source. She says they'll be the instrument, that it's through their instrumentality that God will punish the world. So whatever this tip of the spear is, it has to be something that they can use, or at the very least alter in such a way that it causes this catastrophe. That holds true regardless of how we interpret this vision. Now either it's a freak accident, or it's the intentional murder of countless people around the world, which would make it an act of war. Or it could be both. It could be an attack either by them or by somebody else that they interfere with, that accidentally causes something completely other than what was intended. But either way, I think that's the reason that Lucy mentions war at all in this earthquake-centric vision. And again, she didn't mention seeing a war. She specifically saw the tip of the spear strike the axis, and she saw earthquakes in specific places and floods and people dying. Then she mentions a war. She doesn't say she sees the war, unless what we just saw is the war. Because the event that we're seeing here is either the opening shot or the finishing move of a war with Russia. And if this is an act of war, then the tip of the spear is most likely a weapon. Now, the idea that Fatima predicted a weapon that could create earthquakes probably sounds pretty far-fetched, but this is actually something that Malachi Martin said. I didn't come up with this idea. The month before this diary entry was released, Suzanne Pearson gave a talk at one of the Fatima conferences. She said that she had gotten to know Malachi Martin in the last couple of years of his life and related a private conversation they had where he gave her a little clue to the secret. Here's a few clips.
Then he said, "You see, there's going to be a new form of energy. The important thing about this new form of energy is that it will be very cheap. So cheap that it could supply the needs of every man, woman, and child on earth if it were in the right hands. But it is not in the right hands. It is in the hands of those who will use it to kill and destroy." I then asked, "You don't mean our country, do you?" And he said, "No, America is evil. We are guilty of many sins, but we are not that evil. not evil enough to deliberately kill 1 billion people. We wouldn't do that, but they would. And who are they? He wouldn't tell me. Father Martin told radio host Art Bell on several occasions that if someone quoted the exact words of the true secret and asked him if this was it, he would have to say yes. So, callers often did offer texts for his evaluation. Usually, these emphasized horrific disasters like earthquakes, tidal waves, tsunamis, and so forth. Once, after listening to several possible secrets, which he said were not the text he was shown in 1960, he said, quote, "What all these have in common is that they describe upheavals in nature, as if nature itself were rebelling against the human race. Some of these things are in the secret, but remember, when these things begin to happen, it is not nature, and it is not God."
Generally, I don't admit private conversations into my evidence pool lightly, so let's take a minute to justify this. As far as I know, Father Martin never mentioned any of this publicly, but he said some things that could be interpreted as alluding to them. He did say that he believed we would discover a new source of energy, one abundant enough to enable intergalactic travel, in 2 different interviews actually, and that's not the sort of thing you'd expect to come up in conversation that often. Here, listen to the confidence in his voice.
That had to be changed if there was going to be a new world order grouping all the Society of Nations together, especially a group of nations like those in the Middle East who hold oil. And oil is essential for the world at the present moment until scientists come up with a non-oil source of energy, which they will, but at the present moment we depend on that.
By the way, listen, you and I know, we all know, but we don't know much more than that. We do know that we have exhausted the means of energy. We have fossil fuel and we have got nuclear energy.
It's a finite supply.
Yeah, for number one, it's finite, and number two, we know that for what we want to do, travel, galaxy travel, we need another source of energy.
Yes, sir.
And we will get it. We will get it.
She said that he mentioned the natural disasters that aren't caused by nature during an Art Bell interview, but I'd listened to all 7 and there was nothing like that in there. When I realized that, I actually went full journalist on this and contacted Suzanne to see if she had any comment. She replied that she was confident that it was in the 7th interview, though she knows that it's not in the one that was publicly released by the Art Bell program. She used to have an audio cassette that was recorded directly from the radio broadcast. She listened to it many times and swears that it was in there somewhere. She thought it was the most dramatic line in the whole interview, so it really stood out to her. The presentation she gave was kind of a last-minute thing, so she didn't have time to document all of her sources beforehand. When she went to provide footnotes later, she realized the situation. Her assumption is that it was cut from the official release for one reason or another. Given the large amounts of dead air they have in there, I doubt it would have been for time constraints. Maybe it was something Father Martin requested, or maybe someone just forgot to hit the record button after coming back from a commercial break. At 1 hour, 10 minutes, and 25 seconds in the 7th interview, there's a commercial break that comes back somewhat unceremoniously, and a comment like that would fit the context of what they were talking about. Even if she's misremembering, she says the quote was consistent with everything else that Father Martin told her, including things that were confidential. Whatever the case, this isn't a strike for or against her honesty. If she had just wanted to put words in Father Martin's mouth, she would have said it was from a private conversation, the same as she did for the new form of energy comment. All of her other quotes from the presentation check out, so even if she had intended to lie about this subject, she must have thought that that quote was actually in the interview. The fact that Suzanne gave this theory 1 month before the diary was published might seem like too much of a coincidence, but nobody in the English-speaking community was talking about this thing until several months after it was published. And lastly, if this is something she made up to somehow make herself look better, I would have expected a follow-up after the diary was published and basically validated everything she just said. You know, some kind of a, hey look, I was right, you should listen to me more often kind of a thing. But she never did. The Fatima Center republished part of her talk in an issue of The Crusader years later, but that was it. Suzanne herself hasn't said a word about it since. So lacking any compelling motive for her to make this story up, and having at least some support for the claims in existing interviews, I'm willing to take her word for it. So let's talk about it for a bit. When Father Martin said the United States was not evil enough to do this, but they are, anyone who knew him would know that they means the New World Order. It's something he talked about a lot. He was an avid follower of the conspiracy theories of his day.
The plans of the globalists as such, whether they're in the UN or whether they're in the Trilateral Commission or whether they're in the foreign policy associations around the world, the Bilderbergers.
An order out of chaos, or ordered chaos as he called it, is reportedly the axle of their plan to re-engineer society into a world government. So I think his theory is probably that they would ultimately be behind this, with Russia as their instrument. That definitely makes more sense than a regular government causing global devastation on purpose, so either it's an accident or a clandestine group like the New World Order. So getting back to the question I asked 5 minutes ago, what is this thing? This spear as a flame, or lance like a flame as one translation says, whose tip detaches and touches the Earth's axis. Let's assume for the moment that it's completely literal. What could she be seeing? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is an ICBM. The concept of rocketry is ancient, but a missile sailing in the upper atmosphere probably wasn't something a 27-year-old shepherd girl in Portugal in 1944 would have conceived of or recognized if she saw it. In fact, in her memoir, she describes the first time that she saw a train in 1918. I saw many small houses trotting along one behind the other without either horses or donkeys to pull them, and with lots of people inside looking out the windows, with a great chimney in the front belching out smoke, and it seemed a whole lot of horns sounding at once. And her mother, who had never seen a train, actually didn't believe her. That's how backwater they were. I could easily imagine her describing a multi-stage rocket as a spear that looks like a flame, and the final stage of the rocket, the warhead, is the tip of it that detaches and strikes the target. Another possibility would be some kind of satellite weapon shaped like a spear, and the tip that appears like a detached flame is some kind of energy projection. All of the translations say it touches the axis, which would be a funny verb to describe the impact of a missile. Alternatively, this could easily be a representational scene since, first of all, the Earth's axis isn't a physical or visible thing, and she specifically says axis rather than pole. In fact, while there's no angel mentioned, this could be the same flaming sword from the vision of the bishop in white. The fact that she says the spear in most of the translations suggests that she's already familiar with it, so it might be the one she's already seen. If that's the case, then it's probably just meant to show us God initiating the event without telling us the physical cause of it. It's worth noting that in Lucy's biography itself, their interpretation of it is that a flame is given off from the tip of the spear, rather than the tip of the spear itself detaching. I'm not sure if it's because they're fluent in Portuguese and that's what's actually implied by the phrase, or if it's just because they wanted to compare it to the vision of the bishop in white. I was going to say that, being honest with myself, matching this up with the flaming sword is probably the most likely explanation. But on reconsidering it, there's one major problem with that interpretation. If this is the same thing as the vision of the bishop in white, why are they described in such different terms? In the vision of the bishop in white, she calls it uma espada de fogo, a sword of fire, and its action is described as despedia chamas, gives off flames. That's a really clear phrase. The sword is on fire, and it shoots fire. In the diary, she calls it a ponta da lança como chama, the tip of the spear like a flame. Different word for the weapon, and a vagueness as to what the fire is applied to that I don't think is a result of the translation. I mean, what does as a flame unlatched even mean grammatically? Is it comparing the spear to a flame, the tip to a flame? Or is it a simile for the manner in which the tip detaches? If it was a sword, you'd think she would have just called it that. And that's significant because a sword is something that you hold in your hand, like the angel was holding, whereas a spear is often used as a throwing weapon. So if she saw something floating out in space, she may well have been more inclined to call it a spear than a sword. One gets the impression she wasn't quite sure what it was, so instead of giving it a name, she just described what it looked like she did with the train in my earlier example. Given that she wrote down these two visions, if not within minutes of each other, then at least within days of each other, it would be weird for her to use such radically different phrasing for the exact same thing. So if there's any connection here at all, I think the most likely one is that the angel's fire is representative of the literal reality that Lucy is seeing in this other vision. Though I concede it's definitely an open question. Whatever it is, it touches the axis and the whole planet trembles. Then we see earthquakes, presumably worldwide. We see a whole range of settings from cities down to villages, occurring either simultaneously or in a short span of time, as I said before, that are strong enough to bury mountains. Which is an odd phrase. I assume it means bury them in their own rubble, i.e. level them, since I can't think of anything else you could bury them under. It's difficult to get exact figures on the kind of damage each rating of earthquake typically causes, but from what I've gathered, it looks like at least a 7.5 on the Richter scale to cause any significant topographical change. Think about that for a moment. Global earthquakes. How is that even possible? Even from a purely science fiction perspective, even with unlimited energy, What kind of mechanism could you employ to generate that much tectonic activity without also wiping out all life on the planet? Well, the most obvious one to me would be to violently change the Earth's rotational velocity, either slow it down suddenly or change its axis. One way of doing that would be to hit the planet with a large body like the Moon, but that would destroy all life. And the secret obviously doesn't predict the complete extinction of humanity, and besides, Malachi Martin said it doesn't involve a space rock crashing, so... If not a kinetic force, then the only other two I could conceive of would be gravitational or magnetic forces. Some believe that a close encounter with a rogue planet could change the axis, the Planet X theory. From what I know, I guess that's technically possible, but the odds of the planetoid being just the right mass and passing by at just the right distance to do that without also changing our orbit around the sun and utterly destroying us is astronomically small. Still possible. My main problem with this theory is actually that there's presently no way to weaponize something the size of a planet, so Russia couldn't be instrumental in its passing by. A machine that generates a tremendous gravitational force could change the axis. There was one study that found a link between the position of the sun and the moon and tremors at the San Andreas Fault, so even if it didn't change the axis, an enormous source of gravity could theoretically cause earthquakes. Some believe that electromagnetic forces exerting pressure on the Earth's magnetosphere, coming from sources such as solar flares and gamma ray bursts, are linked to earthquakes. They don't appear to have any significant correlation with sunspots or flares on the long-term average, but one group has found a connection with the magnetic peaks and reversals of the solar polar fields, so it's possible that a weapon that could distort or weaken the Earth's magnetosphere could trigger earthquakes. I've heard that CERN's LHC distorts the magnetosphere when it's turned on, and some have suggested that major earthquakes have correlated with its activity. I don't really have solid sources on that. There are also other large colliders out there, some that we may not know about, and we don't really know their operating schedules, so there's really no way to independently research that. What if the vision wasn't referring to the axis of rotation, but rather the axis of the magnetic pole? This is a bit wild, but maybe what we're talking about is a pole reversal. That's a thing that happens naturally every few million years, and it usually happens gradually over the course of thousands of years. But what if the weapon caused it to happen relatively quickly? While it's changing, the Earth's magnetosphere would be weakened, exposing us to more solar radiation. That could cause a lot of problems, but it probably wouldn't cause earthquakes on the scale we're talking about. So those are the possibilities I can come up with. I don't have any particular theories on the mechanism, actually, other than that it would obviously have to employ scientific principles we don't currently understand, at least publicly. The last physical punishment we see in the vision is the overflowing of the sea, rivers, and clouds. The first two obviously mean flooding. What it can mean for the clouds to exceed their boundaries is unclear. She's probably either talking about torrential rainfall or windstorms. All but one of the translations describes the result as a whirlwind. One of them says vortex, which is a neutral word that could mean wind or water. If we're talking about water, that begs the question of what the vortex is draining into. Maybe fissures opened by the earthquakes? I'm inclined to believe it's something with wind, though, because Malachi Martin had said there would be catastrophes on land, water, and in the atmosphere. As I said before, the flooding is obviously a consequence of the earthquakes. You get tsunamis, and tsunamis give you flooding. Tying either windstorms or rainfall to the same event that causes the earthquakes is a little trickier. For rain, the weapon would have to cause a lot of water to vaporize at once. Assuming that it involves something literally hitting the pole, that could mean melting a lot of polar ice. Windstorms could be created either by shifting the axis or somehow creating massive air temperature differences in key places. Remember, the vision doesn't specify that the flooding and cloud events are global. But even assuming the whole vision is one event, it's possible that the quakes and the cloud overflow are caused by separate things. We could be looking at a war of weather weapons between multiple countries, some that create earthquakes and some that create rain or windstorms. While not public knowledge, there is reason to believe that such technology exists. For example, there was the 1976 UN Treaty on Weather Weapons, there was a famous statement in 1997 by Defense Secretary William Cohen. HAARP was eventually confirmed to be about controlling the ionosphere after they shut it down. I've got links in the report if you're interested, or if you want to dig a little deeper, I'd recommend a YouTube channel called The HAARP Report. So that's everything we see in the vision. Let's talk casualties. They would be highest obviously in the coastal regions, urban environments, fault zones, and areas prone to landslides, sinkholes, and flooding. I've got some numbers. The UN estimates that about 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. Remember that quote from John Paul II? If there is a message in which it is written that the oceans will flood whole areas of the earth and that from one moment to the next millions of people will perish? Yeah, I didn't used to think much of that quote. Surprisingly apt. Earthquakes and floods don't usually have high mortality rates, though. Most of the deaths would be in urban areas, where people will be buried under the remains of buildings or crushed by floating debris. The UN estimates that 54.5% of the world lives in an urban setting, with 2 billion people living in cities with a population of over 500,000. Using a conservative 30% mortality rate, that would be about 600 million people killed just in large cities by the initial event. To put that into perspective, that's more people than were killed in World War I, World War II, the Soviet gulags, and everything that communist China did, combined, times 3. That will pale in comparison to the aftermath, however, because obviously dumping the energy equivalent of what would be hundreds of thousands of Hiroshima bombs onto the Earth at once is going to have some other consequences. The most immediate being the formation of a lot of magma. It's likely that the pressure generated by all those quakes would set off volcanoes over the course of the following weeks and years, perhaps even resurrecting long-dormant volcanoes or creating new ones. This would smother parts of the world in clouds of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide. I know the caldera at Yellowstone is constantly releasing pressure so it never erupts, but if anything will ever set that thing off, this would be it. But a more immediate problem would be nuclear meltdowns. If not from damage to plant systems themselves, then just from the lack of power. Remember Fukushima? Their problem wasn't that the plant got damaged, it was that the coolant system had no power, and their backup generators were flooded. They were bringing in car batteries to keep the thing going. More modern plants have passive cooling systems where they can survive for a while without maintenance, but the vast majority don't. That said, this may not be as bad as it sounds. A meltdown doesn't necessarily equal a containment breach, and a containment breach doesn't necessarily equal an explosion. Given that we're talking about earthquakes that can flatten cities, the plants will probably sustain some structural damage, which could prevent hydrogen gas from building up in the core. Left to itself, the core material would start burning a hole into the ground. If it hits groundwater, then you have China syndrome. But at 3 Mile Island, the core didn't make it through the reactor vessel, so in a best-case scenario, it could just make the plant itself and the area around it uninhabitable. Still, there are currently 450 nuclear plants in the world, the vast majority of them in the Northern Hemisphere. If even a quarter of them release radioactive debris into the atmosphere and surrounding environment, that would be pretty bad. Exactly how bad is difficult to get an answer to. We don't really know what the long-term health consequences of Fukushima are going to be yet. But given the magnitude of these quakes and floods, it's not unreasonable to think that some of these nuclear plants may be completely washed out to sea, even further poisoning the ocean. Additionally, there are various kinds of industrial facilities that store large quantities of dangerous chemicals that could be spilled and contaminate the land, rain, and groundwater. Combined with millions of corpses rotting in the open air, a lack of food, shelter, clean water, and medical supplies, billions are likely to die of disease and starvation within the first few years. The death toll will continue to rise for decades in the form of cancer and long-term ailments from the environmental damage. On this note, there was another small vision Jacinta had where she saw highways and roads and fields full of people who were crying with hunger. Lucy said it was part of the secret, but not which of the 3 parts of the secret it pertained to. It could be World War II, or it could be this. Obviously, a fair amount of chaos and looting goes along with this, but contrary to most disaster movies, I don't think that anarchy will reign. The militaries of the major world powers are likely to hold together. Soldiers being faced with a world of ruin will stick to what they know because first of all the military has tons of resources and second of all they have safety in numbers. While infrastructure will be a mess, with roads torn apart and bridges collapsed and airports unusable and jet fuel scarce anyway, and electricity being out, governments will still maintain some degree of order. On a local level, you'll have looting and bandits and chaos and all that nasty stuff, but as far as the militaries are concerned, I think there'll be enough cohesion that they'll be able to continue functioning and enforce a kind of martial law. This also means that the war this all takes place during won't necessarily end. There might be a respite, but it could pick up again shortly after. How does this fit in with Akita, you might ask? Well, its prediction that the survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead fits perfectly with our picture of the aftermath. And calling it worse than the flood of Noah is believable. That killed most of humanity, but at least it did it quickly, and it didn't poison the land, air, and sea for centuries. But its given cause was fire will fall from the sky and wipe out a great portion of humanity. How does that fit? It could be referring to one small part of the chastisement, perhaps the volcanoes or nuclear weapons from the ongoing war, but it gives the fire as the cause of the massive death. Moreover, why would the apparition focus on one minor part of the chastisement? It's likely that the fire refers to the flaming spear. I think the literal translation of it is that a fire will fall, not fire.
火が天から下り、その災いによって人類の多くの人々が死ぬでしょう。
Akita was never intended to reveal the mechanism of destruction, so we can get away with that kind of a loose connection. Okay, we're finally done with that vision. That's actually all I want to talk about from Lucy. Well, there's one other thing, but I'm saving that for the end. For now, let's talk about Father Malachi Martin. I used to be pretty skeptical of him. He didn't really appear on the Fatima scene until the 90s, when he started writing a bunch of novels and appearing on radio shows, saying he had read The Third Secret, and that he couldn't tell us what it was, but constantly dropping hints about it and making sensational claims about how unimaginably terrible it was. Add to that the fact that he was pretty much the only one who read it talking about the material parts of it, and the suspiciously long list of things that he said were part of it, and you get where I'm coming from. When I started analyzing Lucy's vision, though, it reminded me of some of the things that he had said. I had never really looked deeply into him before, so I went and listened to all of the interviews with him I could find, all 53 hours of them, and whenever he mentioned Fatima, I transcribed that part of the interview. And if you want to save yourself a lot of time, you can find those transcriptions in my report with time-stamped links to the YouTube videos I got them from. You're welcome. And when I had all of it in front of me at once on one sheet of paper, and I compared it to what seemed to be in Lucy's vision, it struck me how well they lined up. Nobody else talked about anything that could fit even remotely as well with that vision. Which is especially striking because if I was going to make up a nation-annihilating prophecy centered around Russia, earthquakes would not be my first choice. Back in the 90s, pretty much everyone was expecting it to be nuclear annihilation, especially if you took Akita into consideration with the whole fire raining from the sky thing. And again, he was the only person really even talking about material chastisements. In fact, it was a growing theory among Fatima researchers that there were no further material chastisements outlined in the Third Secret, that its contents were completely dedicated to Vatican II and the general apostasy. Even the likes of Frere Michel shared this theory, arguing that, since Our Lady talked about material chastisements in the second part of the secret, why would she return to the subject in the third part? Of course, less than a year after Father Martin's death, the Vatican proceeded to release the Vision of the Bishop in White, which showed clear material chastisements. The timing should not be overlooked either, because if they had pulled that kind of a stunt while he was still alive, he would have called them out on it in a heartbeat. He may even have decided that because the secret was officially released, he was no longer bound by his oath and would have proceeded to release the rest of the secret. It wouldn't surprise me at all if the Vatican had been waiting for him to die since the late 80s in order to release that and officially close the books on Fatima. So between that and what I picked up about his character while listening to him, I'm willing to trust him. That said, there are significant issues with his reliability as a source. The main problem is that when he talked about chastisements, he didn't always attribute them to the Third Secret specifically. He usually spoke of them within the context of his own theory about the future, sometimes without saying he was doing so, which turned out to be completely wrong. Basically, he had been told that John Paul II had received a message from Our Lady while recovering from the failed assassination attempt in 1981, where she told him to travel around a lot and make himself known to as many people as possible. Father Martin believed that this was so that, once the warning and the miracle from Garabandal occurred, he would be in a position to spiritually lead the people who would turn to him for answers, and he believed this would happen before the year 2000, which is a date he probably pulled from La Salette. Somewhere along the way he expected the Catholic Church as an institutional organization to effectively dissolve, making John Paul II the last pope of these Catholic times, which is another idea that comes from Garabandal. Then it would acquire a new structural form similar to what it had during the early Christian persecution. Obviously none of that happened, and Garabandal has since shown itself to be false. Then there's the problem of his memory. He read The Secret once, in February 1960. All of these interviews are in the 90s. That's a pretty long time. Now, I'm sure that when you read a famous, long-awaited thing like The Third Secret, with the terrible doomsday prophecies, it makes a memorable impression on you, but sometimes your interpretation of what you read and the literal text get blurred over time. He did make some mistakes on air, quoting from sources that we can check. So he wasn't perfect, but he is still a really valuable source, so let's parse through his comments and see what we can find. Let's start by pulling together all the general things he said about material chastisements. Speaking of chastisements that have been promised without specifically mentioning Fatima, he said, there will be eruptions of volcanoes that are extinct for the last 20 million years, there will be family against family, disruptions of nations and cities, and that it was not merely floods, not merely earthquakes, not merely diseases, but something far worse than that. Speaking of Fatima specifically, he said it predicted several chastisements and catastrophes that the world has never seen, which included catastrophes man-made or natural, on land, on water, and in the atmosphere of the globe, and that it involves the entire world system, not merely one area, not merely one religion, not merely one race. One time he even said whole sections of the continents will be washed away forever. whole nations will perish. He also said a good majority of the present human beings that are alive would survive it, but in great misery, as in a world some people think isn't worth living in. So far that fits with my assessment of Lucy's vision. 20-million-year-old volcanoes suddenly reviving would again require tremendous amounts of tectonic activity to do. Just from the vision I wouldn't have gone so far as to say that portions of continents will be washed away forever, but that certainly wouldn't be surprising considering we're dealing with global earthquakes. Like I said before, if anything is ever going to do it, this would be it. And there are some parts of the world where that possibility has always been considered a danger, looking at you, California. And then there are island nations like Japan or England or Ireland. Remember St. Patrick's prophecy that Ireland will sink into the sea before the coming of the Antichrist? Could be. I had said before that 7.5 on the Richter scale would be the bare minimum for topographic changes. Well, if we're talking about continents breaking off and islands sinking, then I don't even know how to make an intelligent guess at what that would be. The biggest one ever recorded was only a 9.6 at best in Chile in 1960. It caused major landslides, flooding, 80-foot tsunamis, and it triggered a volcanic eruption 38 hours later. Not exactly what I would call mountain leveling. Fun fact, an 18.3 on the Richter scale would contain enough energy to blow up the planet. It's a base 10 logarithmic scale, so every step up is 10 to the 1.5 times more energy than the previous step. Obviously that could never happen, and the Richter scale is actually based on wave magnitude, not energy released. I just thought it would be fun to know. Does the fact that he mentions multiple catastrophes, man-made or natural, mean it's possible that Russia is not the instrument of some of those catastrophes? I could focus on the fact that he said "or" and suggest that it implies that he was unsure, which it was at the time. But in his 1994 interview with Bernard Jansen, he actually said more clearly there are going to be natural catastrophes as well as man-made catastrophes, mistakes made by people. And in Keys of This Blood there's a place where he says it predicts disease, disorder, earthquakes, tidal waves, all kinds of natural catastrophes from the hand of nature's creator. It's possible he was just being vague so as not to give away too much of the secret, but I have a theory on this. I don't think that the secret actually says what causes these disasters. I think it says something vague, like men will create weapons of great destruction powered by a new form of energy, period, there will be earthquakes, floods, etc. Sort of like how Lucy's vision doesn't distinctly associate the war with the natural disasters, but if you think about it for a while you can deduce that it does. The last time Father Martin talked about disasters being definitively natural was his 1994 interview with Bernard Jansen. Suzanne Pearson told me that her first conversation with him where he talked about the weapons was summer of '96, so somewhere between those years I think he had an epiphany, and he asked himself something like, wait, if Russia controls the timetable, then are these natural disasters really natural? That would mean that it was just his interpretation that these were caused by a weapon, but given everything else that we know, I think that's the correct interpretation. It also makes more sense to me that Our Lady wouldn't go into that kind of detail. She did talk about things that the children didn't understand. They didn't know what Russia or the Holy Father were, and she mentioned them in the secret. But even so, it's hard for me to imagine Our Lady talking to them about something like scalar energy weapons. The new form of energy production, on the other hand, I do think is in the secret. While I can see Father Martin assuming that we would need something more than nuclear energy to produce destruction on that scale, the details he gives about it being cheap and applicable to global energy needs sound too specific for it to be speculation. That would have been really irresponsible of him to just assume, even in a private conversation. So I think he was actually speaking from something in the text. All of this is just my impression, though. So I'll admit that it is possible that Russia is not the direct instrument of all of them, but literally every disaster he ever mentioned as part of the secret can be found in Lucy's vision and its aftermath, and Russia being the regulator of the timetable strongly suggests that all these events are dependent on human activity. So I think at the very least the central chastisement has to come from Russia. In Keys of This Blood he expanded on this idea of catastrophes caused by mistakes. There was now no doubt in John Paul's mind that in heaven's agenda all would be thrown into the cauldron of human judgment gone awry, of human evil sanctioned by men as normal, of unparalleled natural catastrophes, and catastrophes caused by the panic of once regnant power brokers scrambling to retain some semblance of their once secure hegemonies, and for their own very survival. This supports the idea that the global earthquakes are an unintended consequence, which I think was already the most likely possibility. Is it an act of desperation from a cornered Russia? Or does he mean mistakes like Fukushima? Could that have been one of the man-made catastrophes? Given its tremendous scope, you'd think it would appear in a prophecy somewhere, although there are some people who say Fukushima wasn't an accident. Either way, I want to highlight the severity that he always attached to the central chastisement. Like I said, he said it isn't just earthquakes and floods, there's something much worse to it than that, and he never heard an explanation that was bad enough for him, no matter how exaggerated it sounded. Here, listen to this.
The following is a transcription of what is possibly the third Secret of Fatima, as read by Art Bell over the air on Coast to Coast AM on 5/14/98 at 34 minutes and 48 seconds into the program. And I began it with this preamble. All right, I in no way warrant the following as being authentic. I have no way of knowing. All I can tell you is it feels real. It is alleged to be the third secret of Fatima. You decide for yourself. Here we go. A great plague will befall mankind. Nowhere in the world will there be order. Satan will rule the highest places, determining the way of things. He will succeed in seducing the spirits of the great scientists who invent arms with which it will be possible to destroy a large part of humanity in a few minutes. Satan will have his power. The powerful who command the people and who will incite them to produce enormous quantities of arms. God will punish man more thoroughly than with the flood. There will come the time of all times and the end of all ends. The great and powerful will perish together with the small and weak. Even for the church, it will be the time of its greatest trial. Cardinals will oppose cardinals. Bishops will oppose bishops. Satan will walk among them. And in Rome, there will be changes. The church will be darkened, and the world will be shaking with terror. One great war will erupt in the second half of the 20th century. Fire and smoke will fall from the sky. The waters of the oceans will change into steam, and the steam will rise and overflow everything. The waters of the ocean will become mist. Millions and millions of people will die from hour to hour. Whoever remains alive will envy the dead. Everywhere one turns one's glance, there is going to be anguish and misery, ruins in every country. The time draws nearer. The abyss widens without hope, the good to perish with the bad, the great with the small, the princes of the church with the faithful, the rulers with their people. There will be death everywhere because of the errors committed by non-believers and crazy followers of Satan, which will then, and only then, take control over the world. At the last, those who survive will at every chance newly proclaim God and His glory, and they will serve Him as when the world was not so perverted. Bearing in mind what I just read,
Yes.
would you consider the third secret to be as traumatic as is suggested in what I read, or more so?
More so.
More so.
More so. Yeah. Much more so. Without, again, I'll step in very carefully.
Yes, sir.
The central element in the third secret is awful, and it's not in that.
It's not in that. It's not in the.
No, it's not.
So without minimizing or without exaggerating, you're telling me that what's in the third secret is more horrible than what I just read. Which
yes, Art, it is. Because what you have just read, essentially, it is the onslaught of natural powers. Sure, Satan is walking, etc., like that, amongst men, and blah, 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 patati, patata. But essentially it is as if nature revolted against the human race. That's essentially what, through all these terrible catastrophes and chastisements. And that's not the essence of the third secret, and not the frightening one.
Now, to say it's worse than the oceans boiling sounds pretty cartoonishly over the top. This is actually one of the things that made me skeptical of him. But to be fair, he may not have been paying a lot of attention to that part or really considered the consequences of that. You might be tempted to think that when he says it's worse, he's talking about the spiritual chastisement. As the Bishop of Fatima said, the loss of faith in a continent is worse than the annihilation of a nation. But that's not the case. He said it would fill confessionals on a Saturday evening with worshippers kneeling down, striking their breast. That's a picture of people who are afraid of dying in sin, not people who have just been scandalized about massive corruption in the church they're filling. It would have to be something, I think, that has permanent effects on the planet in order to meet this level of hype. Like maybe the axis being changed, or the composition of the atmosphere changing, or the ozone dissipating, or the rotational speed of the Earth changing, or something wild like that. I think the axis getting thrown off is the most likely one. It's named in the vision, and of all the possible ways I came up with to cause global earthquakes, that one seems the most plausible. There's also the miracle of the sun. Like many others, I believe that it was a preview of what the chastisement will look like. Surely it wasn't just an arbitrary choice of miracle. The miracle had 3 phases. First of all, it looked like a silver disk, not like the sun, and it was spinning off colors like a pinwheel, turning on its own axis. The colored light is probably the weapon interacting with the Earth's magnetosphere, creating an aurora effect. The silver disk might even represent the weapon itself, or some component of this reaction. Next, they saw the sun start flying around in the sky. If you think about it, if you actually saw the sun start flying around, and it wasn't a miracle, that would not mean the sun is moving, that would mean that the Earth is moving, or more specifically that it's spinning in wild directions. Now, that can't actually happen, at least not at the speeds that the people were seeing in the miracle. That would kill everyone. It could just be a dramatic representation of the Earth's rotational direction changing more slowly, or it could be that land masses are being thrown around so violently that for those on the ground it looks like the sun and everything in the sky is moving in circles. The last part was the sun, or the silver disk, turning fiery red and crashing down to Earth. That probably represents the demise of the weapon. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's the best explanation I've ever heard for the miracle of the sun. Most people just focus on that last part. One of the most confusing things to me that Father Martin said was that there would be a sign in the heavens. He said that it would be physical, visible, an irremovable sign once it appears. Will do no direct harm, although some people might die from heart attack or anguish or fear, and that it would illuminate everyone's conscience so they would know where they stand with God. Another time he clarified, it's not physical, it will have a physical manifestation, ruling out that it would be a natural event, specifically saying it wasn't a comet. When asked if it was a repeat of the miracle of the sun, he explicitly said, "We don't know what it is, God hasn't said." In case of this blood, he'd said that it has something to do with the sun, but that was earlier, and many times afterwards he entertained all kinds of speculation about what it could be. My main problem with all of this is that that's the prophecy of Garabandal, to a T. That is the warning, an illumination of conscience where everybody will know where they stand with God and that it will be terrible and it would be better to die than live through 5 minutes of it, and some people will die of heart attack and fright, etc. Although actually he's got it slightly mixed up. There was nothing permanent or irremovable about the warning. That was the miracle, a sign that was supposed to appear between the pine trees on the hill in Garabandal. And yes, I know Medjugorje predicted a similar sign, but Father Martin called that out as a fraud several times, so he wouldn't have incorporated that. Little confession. 10 years ago I wrote a report on Catholic prophecy in general called Talk Among the Prophets, and it was bad. It was really bad. That was before I had research standards. But as a result of that, I have all of the source documents related to Garabandal, and one of the interviews with Jacinta from February 1977 talks about a sign that will be seen in the air everywhere in the world during the warning. And Conchita said it begins with the letter A. I don't know. But this comes back to what I said at the beginning. He didn't always talk about the third secret. He talked about what he believed would happen in the future as a whole. And he usually spoke of this sign in general terms. However, there was one time he specifically called it the sign of Fatima, and another time he stated this idea comes from Fatima and that it's going to fulfill all the things predicted at Fatima in 1917. Moreover, for a while he was saying there was a strong possibility of the sign coming between the winter and summer of 1996 and 97. No other prophecy that I know of offers information that could lead to that conclusion. The Garabandal miracle was supposed to take place in March, April, or May on the feast of a saint martyred for the Eucharist, but that was to come within 12 months after the warning, which had no time frame at all. But it wasn't supposed to occur until after communism had overrun the world and it was impossible to celebrate the Mass freely anywhere. So either he got that mixed up too, or that guess was based on something mentioned in the secret. So maybe there is something mentioned in the third secret about a sign coming before the chastisement, and he just assumed it was the same event as the warning of Garabandal because they matched up and he believed in both of them. Now, I seriously doubt it involves anything like the illumination of conscience, but a warning sign preceding the chastisement does fit Fatima. It would probably be something like the night illumined by an unknown light that heralded the coming of World War II. Side note, it's interesting that the World War II sign looked similar to a red aurora, which is the interaction of solar emissions with the Earth's magnetosphere. I wonder if this sign of Fatima, heralding World War III perhaps, could be caused by the weapon's interaction with the Earth's magnetosphere, maybe during an experimental or testing phase. So bottom line on this, I think it's certainly plausible, but I wouldn't stake my life on there being a warning sign. If you're looking for some kind of a signal, I would look for a war with Russia. Again, the event might be the beginning of that war, but if it's not, when you see a war like that start, that's going to be your sign to quit your job and go live in the mountains. Which brings us to the next topic, the date. When is this going to happen? And nobody is going to like my answer. Father Martin confirms there is no date given in the text of The Secret, and all of the guesses that he gave us have passed. The furthest one he gave was in 1997 when he said it would not be 20 years before it happened, and that was 20 years ago this year. Now, we all know the story of the King of France. St. Margaret Mary delivered a message that the king had to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and 100 years to the day later, none of the subsequent kings had done it, so the French Revolution happened. And at Tui, our Lord made a random allusion to this incident, so the common hypothesis is that the chastisement will be 100 years to the day after Fatima, so either 2017 or June 13th, 2029, when the request for the consecration was made. Right? The problem with this is that nobody in 18th century France would have seen it that way. St. Margaret Mary's request was on June 17, 1689. What actually happened on June 17, 1789 was that the Third Estate, which had already been meeting separate from the Estates General and gathering support for 4 days, declared themselves the National Assembly and began usurping the king's legislative authority. To anyone witnessing it unfold, this might have been a foreboding turn of events, but nobody would have thought of it as the culmination of a divine punishment. You could only see it that way in retrospect, and you could just as easily pick May 5th as the start because that's when the Third Estate broke from the Estates General and began meeting separately, or July 11th, the storming of the Bastille, or February 13th, 1790, when the state dissolved all of the religious orders and began the institutional persecution of the Church, or the king's execution on January 21st, 1793. Personally, I would pick the Reign of Terror, the real bloodbath of the French Revolution, where they sent 16,500 people to the guillotine, imprisoned and massacred priests, and destroyed churches and religious images throughout France, which began on June 2nd, 1793, 4 years later. Napoleon appeared in 1795, 6 years later. I would argue that the only reason anybody picks June 17th is because it sounds more impressive to say that it all started 100 years to the day from the request. St. Margaret Mary never gave a deadline, so there's really no reason to hold to that. But even if you want to pick that date, the deaths didn't start until years later. Also recall that our Lord's comment was specifically directed at the clergy. He said, "Make it known to my ministers, given that they follow the example of the King of France in delaying the execution of my requests, they will follow him into misfortune." So I know this is kind of disappointing, but we're not necessarily going to see anything big occur on May or October 13th, 2017, or June 13th, 2029. If we do, it will probably be limited to something involving the clergy, such as a schism or a pope being stripped of his authority. That would likely be a sign that the actual event would be near at hand, but from that point on, we'd be completely in the dark. It could be months or years. Not to completely downplay the significance of the centenary, I'm sure that our Lord alluded to the King of France incident for a reason, and it was probably to give an indication of timetable. I'm just pointing out that the major punishment didn't come until 4 years later, so don't get hung up on the exact year. Okay, moving on. The last major element Malachi Martin tells us is in the third secret is the 3 days darkness. Most of you probably know what that is, but just in case, this is a well-known prophecy in our day. Father Martin was no doubt familiar with it. It speaks of 3 days when no source of light will provide men with illumination except for blessed candles. People will die of fear and despair, visible demons roaming the earth, fire raining from the sky, killing anyone who beholds it. It's actually very reminiscent of the 9th plague of Egypt when, quote, "darkness which may even be felt covered the land." There's also a mention of the sun turning black in Apocalypse 6, verse 12, but the best mirror is actually an obscure text in Wisdom, chapter 17, which recounts the Egyptian plague in greater detail. If you're into the 3 days darkness, I would definitely read that text. It's pretty much exactly the same, except nobody dies and there's no blessed candles. Side note, since we mentioned demons roaming the earth, you may have heard a theory that CERN is actually trying to open a portal to hell. I want to just briefly mention why that's theologically wrong. Like I said, demons can already physically manifest now. Any experienced exorcist will tell you that. They don't need portals to cross over. They need permission. For a biblical example, check the first chapter of Job. Satan needs to get God's permission before he can go and kill Job's family and his servants and his livestock. And when God gave him that permission, he even put a limit on him and said you can't physically harm him. He has no ability to act except within the parameters that he's allowed. If you want another example, check Jude verse 9. They don't need portals, they need permission. So even if you did build a portal to the physical location of hell, you wouldn't release anything because there's nothing physically there. And the spiritual beings that are there don't need portals to physically manifest. Sorry, that's just something that's been bugging me. Now, there's a lot of, let me say, rumors about this prophecy. First of all, sometimes you'll read that the candles have to be 100% beeswax in order to work. As far as I know, no prophet has ever said that. Second, it's sometimes said that this is an event that's been predicted by hundreds of saints and mystics. If you only count people who mentioned specifically 3 days of darkness, then it's probably 1 or 2 dozen. If you include everyone who predicted a great chastisement and just assume that they're all talking about the same event, then maybe you could approach those numbers. Most of them are very short mentions of it, attributed to obscure saints and mystics that I've never been able to find sources for at all, but there are 3 major ones. Blessed Anna Maria Taigi and Blessed Elizabeth Kennor Mora from the 1800s, and Padre Pio from 1950. Each of them has a unique version attributed to them, with some unique details, but essentially they're all the same. I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily believe every prophecy that's attributed to a person who has the word blessed in front of their name. I've seen some pretty bad ones. Of these 3, the only one I'm familiar enough with to give credence to would be Padre Pio. The problem then becomes that I don't have a way to confirm that he actually said this. His version supposedly comes from 4 private letters that were obtained by the Commission of Heraldsbach, but I have no avenue of confirming that. I've never seen scans of them, I've never even seen the Italian version of them. All I have are English versions that people have published over the years. In fact, I and other researchers have been completely unable to find any mention of the Commission of Heraldsbach outside of these claims. And one author, Desmond Birch, claims to have documents from the Capuchin Order specifically denying that Padre Pio wrote these letters. But leaving the question of authenticity aside, we can reasonably presume that Malachi Martin had to be referring to at least one of these 3 versions, right? So let's go through them. We'll start with Padre Pio. It's really long, so I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but here are the highlights. My judgment shall come upon them suddenly and when least expected. Watch the sun and the moon and the stars of the heavens. When they appear to be unduly disturbed and restless, know that the day is not far away. The powers of nature shall be moved, and a rain of fire shall make people tremble with fear. Let no one go across the yard, even to feed the animals. He who steps outside will perish. Cover your windows carefully. My elect shall not see my wrath. Hurricanes of fire will pour forth from the clouds and spread over the entire earth. Storms, bad weather, thunderbolts, and earthquakes will cover the earth for 2 days. An uninterrupted rain of fire will take place. It will begin during a very cold night. The wind will carry with it poisonous gases, which will be diffused over the entire earth. It also says, no harm shall come to those who are in the state of grace and who seek my mother's protection, which is in striking contrast to the prophecy of Akita, which said the chastisement would wipe out, quote, the good as well as the bad. And in all 3 versions of the 3 days' darkness, when it's over, the godless shall be annihilated so that afterwards the just shall be able to start afresh. A picture of great hope is painted. In some versions they even have St. Peter coming down from heaven to lead everyone, contrasting the survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead, which is not just from Akita, but is also something that Father Martin said, in specific reference to the 3rd secret. Moreover, if that's true, that's not just the annihilation of nations. If only faithful Catholics will be left, then that's the annihilation of most of the human race. And again, Father Martin said most of the human race would survive the chastisement. Other than the brief mention of earthquakes and poisonous gases, none of this lines up with Lucy's vision or any of the statements that Father Martin gave describing the chastisement. Elizabeth Kennor Mora's version actually doesn't mention 3 days of darkness, but otherwise it seems to be describing the same event as the Padre Pio letters. It has all of the problems we just discussed and more, so I'm just going to skip over it. Anna Maria Taigi's version, the oldest of the 3, is less problematic. It's also fairly short, so I'll just read it to you. God will send 2 punishments. One will be in the form of wars, revolutions, and other evils. It shall originate on earth. The other will be sent from heaven. There shall come over the whole earth an intense darkness lasting 3 days and 3 nights. Nothing can be seen, and the air will be laden with pestilence, which will claim mainly, but not only, the enemies of religion. It will be impossible to use any man-made lighting during this darkness except blessed candles. He who out of curiosity opens his window to look out or leaves his home will fall dead on the spot. During these 3 days, people should remain in their homes, pray the rosary, and beg God for mercy. All the enemies of the Church, whether known or unknown, will perish over the whole earth during that universal darkness, with the exception of a few whom God will soon convert. The air shall be infected by demons who will appear under all sorts of hideous forms. After the 3 days of darkness, St. Peter and St. Paul, having come down from heaven, will preach in the whole world and designate a new pope. A great light will flash from their bodies and will settle on the cardinal who is to become pope. Christianity then will spread throughout the world. He is the holy pontiff chosen by God to withstand the storm. At the end he will have the gift of miracles, and his name shall be praised over the whole earth. Whole nations will come back to the Church, and the face of the earth will be renewed. Russia, England, and China will come into the Church. So this one doesn't make the claim that only the bad will die, or that only Catholics will survive at the end. It does say that all the enemies of the Church will die, but that could mean the institutional organizations that are enemies, not, for example, every Muslim on the planet or every atheist on the planet. But it does have another problem. The darkness itself and the pestilence in the air could be man-made. But there's nothing in nature that will instantly kill you if you look at it, but if you put a black bag over your head, you're fine. I can't even think of something that would instantly kill you like that staying inside of a regular house would protect you from. This is clearly a supernatural death, something akin to people who drop dead from touching the Ark of the Covenant or the 10th plague of Egypt. So Russia can't be the instrument of that. There's also no mention of earthquakes or anything similar to Lucy's vision or anything else that Father Martin talked about, so again, this doesn't seem to be the same event. However, this does run aground of the predictions of Fatima because it ends with Russia being converted, and unless they're going to be unconverted and reconverted somewhere in the distant future, this would have to take place somewhere during those events, after the initial chastisement. And that actually seems to be what Father Martin thought, because there was one time when he plugged the 3 days darkness into the events of the Antichrist, which he put later.
We talked some time ago about 3 days of darkness. You said it would be dangerous to be abroad outside your home or even inside your home.
Yes.
Somebody is asking, what is the nature of the danger? Is it civil, natural, spiritual?
It is spiritual.
Spiritual.
Spiritual, yes. That particular prophetic fact, excuse my diction, is based on a private revelation which churchmen have accepted, which the Roman churchmen have accepted, made in various places in the year 1846 in La Salette, France, and in Fatima, Portugal in 1917, and then at various other places since then. And it concerns the arrival of a final chastisement, a punishment from God to purify men and women and prepare them for entry into heaven. Not rapture-like, according to the normal one evangelical theory, but actually the end of the world. It's not exactly around the corner, Art. It's at the time when a figure called the Antichrist is abroad, and it's a very complicated issue, the whole thing, but the actual danger itself during those 3 days of total darkness over the earth, the dimming of the sun completely, and no light, it's a time when the last efforts of the demons to run our lives and to rescue, take souls away from the salvation that Christ has worked out.
Notice, however, that he doesn't mention anything about people dying there. He says the point of it is to purify the hearts of men to prepare them for their judgment at the end of the world. The only danger he mentions is a spiritual danger, demons trying to lead souls to hell, presumably by trying to frighten them into despair. You might be inclined to think that he was just limiting himself there and didn't mention any of the physical parts of the prophecy. But then there's this.
3 days without sun?
3 days without the lateral light we're used to, Art, yes. Without that. But it's like everything else, when it takes place, they will endeavor to give it an astronomical and a geophysical explanation.
And what are some of these chastisements that have been promised us?
Widespread hunger, widespread war, disease, then awful things which are exceptions like 3 days darkness over the entire world, baffling all our meteorologists and scientists who won't know what's happening, who will have various explanations, any explanation except the hand of God.
Baffling all our meteorologists and scientists, because apparently organized meteorology and science are still going to be things after this event, and they'll be just as dominated by atheism as ever. This is not a mass death event. I know this goes completely contrary to what you would expect from someone like Father Martin, but he was not talking about the 3 days darkness. He was talking about 3 days of darkness. He apparently had his own version of this. Either that or he was referencing some obscure prophet that I'm not even aware of. To him, the 3 days of darkness was literally a repeat of the 9th plague of Egypt. The sun goes dark for 3 days, everyone is scared, the end. And he puts it during the reign of Antichrist, towards the end of the world. He even went so far as to call it a final chastisement. That means that the entire Fatima episode as we know it would have to have already concluded at this point, because remember, after the consecration and the conversion of Russia, there's a significant period of peace. So this has obviously got to be after that. That distances it from Anna Maria's version of the prophecy because, like I said, that has to come right before the consecration, because it ends with Russia being converted. Having said that, I find it hard to believe that he would say that Fatima mentions 3 days of darkness and then describe his own version, which is completely different from the modern version, if in fact the modern version was actually part of the secret. So as I see it, if Father Martin's testimony is true, then it's highly unlikely that Anna Maria's prophecy is also true. The other versions could still fit somewhere in the future after the Fatima events, but they all end with a period of peace, not the end of the world, which either means they happened during the time of Antichrist, conflicting with Father Martin's version, and that the Antichrist is not the end of the world, which, while not the traditional Catholic understanding, is tenable if you literally interpret the 1,000-year reign of Christ in Apocalypse 20. Or there is another period of decadence and another mass death event after the Fatima events, but before the events of the Antichrist. Personally, I think Father Martin's version sounds more likely. But is the 3 days darkness actually referenced in Fatima at all? Notice that he said it was also mentioned at La Salette. Well, it wasn't. Not explicitly, anyway. There's nothing about 3 days of darkness there. But it's not unpopular to believe that some of the things mentioned at La Salette refer to the same event. The original version of La Salette has nothing like that in it, but the 1878 version that Melanie released, which opens with the Mother of God not knowing what language the children speak to give you some idea of how credible it is, does include a similar mass death event. It says, "Suddenly the persecutors of the Church of Jesus Christ and all those given over to sin will perish, and the earth will become desert-like." And then 25 years later, everybody completely forgets that that happened and goes back to sinning, and the Antichrist comes. But that lines up with the modern version of the 3 days darkness, not with Father Martin's version. So did he actually mean to reference the modern version and just wasn't thinking at all about what he was saying? Did he forget what was in La Salette? There's another line later on that talks about a continuous series of evolutions for 3 days. That one does take place during the Antichrist events right before the end of the world, so maybe that's what he meant? One way or another, it does show that he was willing to associate two events that he interpreted as being the same thing without qualifying that he was doing so. This version of La Salette also mentions things that you could associate with Fatima. It mentions earthquakes that swallow mountains and countries and the fall of Rome. So was there actually something in the third secret that references 3 days of darkness, or did he associate it with that because he associated it with La Salette, and he associated La Salette with the 3 days darkness? Or was there something in the 3 days darkness that he associated Fatima with? The bottom line, I think, is whatever he was talking about. Both times that he brought it up, he put it during the reign of Antichrist, beyond the triumph, which puts it outside of the scope of what we're interested in here. Whether it's true or not is kind of unimportant. I guess I'm somewhat curious academically speaking, but honestly, if I was in the middle of the reign of the Antichrist, then God turning off the lights for 3 days would be the least of my worries. One time Father Martin was asked about the Vatican Observatory and what they're looking for, and he mentioned that it had to do with prophecy.
The Vatican, despite environmental obstacles that would not normally be overcome by anybody else, in conjunction with the University of Arizona, muscled its way onto Mount Graham and constructed an observatory. Can you enlighten me at all as to why they have such an obsessive interest in astronomy?
Yes, I can. In general terms, Art. The reason is this. They've always had this, by the way. They've always had an observatory, not always. It dates from about the 9th century A.D., but there's intense interest now in astronomy because of the contents of some of the secret revelations they claim were made in this century about the near future, involving the stars, involving astronomical data. It's about as general a statement as I'd be allowed to make.
Oh, I think I can read that one quite well.
Okay, I'm sure you cannot. But there definitely is an interest of, because they're looking for the evidence they need to decide that certain things must be done.
But notice that he says it was based on revelations they claim were made in this century. That shows that it's something that he was not personally familiar with. If it was the third secret, he probably would have outright said it was in the secret. But at the very least, he would have said it was something that was revealed, rather than something that they claim was revealed. Now maybe you think I'm reading too much into his exact wording there, but even if I am, what would he be talking about? He said it doesn't involve a meteorite, and Russia can't cause Planet X. It's not the sign in the heavens either, because he already said it's not anything natural like a comet. It's not related to the sun or the moon, because he said specifically the stars and astronomical data. So what are we left with? The positioning of the stars? Are they looking for a very gradual declination in the Earth's axis over the years? I just can't think of a good explanation that would be relevant to the third secret. So this might be a real thing, but it's not part of Fatima. The last major clue he gave us was what he thought Russia's reaction to the third secret would be. He talked about it primarily in Keys of This Blood. Why, one questioner asked, did John the 23rd refuse to obey the requests of the third secret? John Paul's answer was pregnant with his own pre-1981 reading of the text. Given the seriousness of its contents, he explained, my predecessors in the Petrine office diplomatically preferred to postpone publication so as not to encourage the world power of communism to make certain moves. His words also point to a mortal danger facing the capitalist nations, about which Lucia is quite explicit in the text of the third secret. Understood in its depth and extent, John Paul's reference can be shocking, so as not to encourage the world power of communism to make certain moves. The Pope and the grizzled men who run the Vatican are not quixotic idealists living in a dream world of superstition and irrational fantasies. In fact, their realism can be numbing. If they or he could come to such a conclusion and make such a statement, it must be accurate and based on objective facts. In that third secret indeed, Lucia's words are so explicit and so verifiable, and therefore so authentic that, were the leaders of the Leninist Party state to know those words, they would in all probability decide to undertake certain territorial and militaristic moves against which the West could have few, if any, means of resisting, and the Church would be plunged into further and deeper subjugation to the Party state. Lucia's words underline a terrible vulnerability in the capitalist nations. That is the seriousness of Lucia's words. The capitalist West could be entrapped by the USSR. In Vatican parlance, Lucia's words have a dire geopolitical meaning. They must not be treated as pious and devotional outpourings. Her words from the Fatima happening are primarily related to the fierce politics of nations. Ever since John the 23rd opened and read those words, the Vatican has treated them gingerly. Fatima has been politicized. John Paul from the start has gone along with that politicization. In Vatican foreign policy since the opening of the envelope, the cardinal principle has been to foment devotion to Mary as Our Lady of Fatima, but never to make political decisions very obviously in the light of the third secret. That is really interesting. I didn't expect something like this. He says that the third secret talks explicitly about the politics of nations, even going so far as to underline a vulnerability in the capitalist nations that the communist powers would be able to verify and take advantage of. The part about verifying it is the most interesting to me. It means that their intelligence network already had the ability to confirm this, it's just something they had never thought to check before. It isn't that Russia would be able to confirm one part of the prophecy and then they would believe the other part, because that would be stupid of them. Aside from being atheists, they know that the Vatican allies itself with the West. So from their perspective, any quote-unquote prophecy could be designed to lead them into a trap. We'd have to be talking about a real vulnerability that they've just never thought of before, and that they can empirically prove is real apart from the text. Now, we could be talking about a military advantage. It could be that the West was not as powerful as the communists had supposed that they were, and that they would not be able to respond to the degree that they had been expecting. But how would they verify that? And if they were able to verify it, why hadn't they verified it already? That's the sort of thing your intelligence community is supposed to be working on. Moreover, he didn't say that it would allow them to crush the West. He specifically said entrap them. It was something that would allow them to make territorial moves, presumably taking over some more of Eastern Europe and spreading out into Asia and the Pacific, without the West retaliating. So it sounds like a kind of threat or blackmail, or some kind of other political boundary that the West would be unwilling to cross. Maybe something to do with the New World Order? Whatever it is, it's transnational. We're talking about the entire West, not just one country, so if it was blackmail, it would have to involve a multinational conspiracy. But that brings up the same objection of, shouldn't the Russian intelligence community already know these things? And if they didn't know them in the 1960s, shouldn't they have figured them out somewhere in the last half-century? A few pages later, he says something that, if he's talking about the same thing, gives us a clearer picture. Thus, as 1981 ended, his own fate as Pope and Poland's fate as a nation were seen by him as mere functioning parts in a new geopolitical pattern already setting in. Russia, indicated as the key factor by the third secret, constituted the dominant orientation of that new and vaster pattern. And suddenly it became of vital importance to John Paul that the text of that third secret had not been published, and that the Pope with his bishops had not consecrated Russia into the care of Mary. For now immediately looming on his papal horizon, he could see the shape of things to come, the decreasing vibrancy of faith in Catholic communities, the darkening of European minds, the betrayal by his churchmen of their pastoral function, the spreading net of Leninist Marxist deception looping in all the nations in a geopolitical trap, the onslaught of physical chastisements to come, disease, disorder, earthquakes, tidal waves, all kinds of natural catastrophes from the hands of nature's creator. So he kind of summed up the entire third secret right there. First he talks about the spiritual chastisement, then about Russia's political posturing, and then the material chastisements, though presumably without mentioning the central one. He describes a geopolitical trap as the spreading net of Leninist Marxist deception looping in all the nations. He could just be talking about the ideology of Marxism entrapping various nations in its grasp. But if it's the same entrapment he was talking about before, then he may be talking about a strategic political deception. He often talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union being a deception designed to lure the West into a false sense of security. But that doesn't underline a vulnerability in the West, it's an attempt to create a vulnerability. Moreover, I don't see how it could involve any deception, because if the secret was published, then the deception would be public. And it wouldn't deceive anyone, right? So this must be a different entrapment. He's probably talking about Mikhail Gorbachev infiltrating the European Union and using economic influence to eventually usurp leadership of the New World Order. That was something he talked about earlier in the book. Maybe we're talking about an economic vulnerability, that kind of threat or blackmail. But what could they use to affect the economy of the entire West? It could involve some kind of shift in the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction, the revelation to Russia that some technology they already had gave them the ability to neutralize the West's nuclear capabilities. But I mean, did they really have this weapon way back then? How would they verify that the West didn't have it? And if they had the ability to do that, why wouldn't they do it anyway? I just can't come up with any scenario where this works. Like, I can't even say I think Father Martin is wrong because I have no idea what he could be talking about. So let's just go on to his next clue. He tells us that John Paul originally thought that the chastisement would be in the distant future, but when he saw certain political developments, he believed that he would be the one to see it. As he convalesced in the Policlinico Gemelli that August, the concrete facts of the situation worked to change an attitude in John Paul. Those facts were the growing crisis in Poland between solidarity and the government, the new twist in Moscow's attitude to solidarity as something dangerous and to be crushed, the gap left by Wyszynski's death, a gap that the new primate of Poland, Joseph Cardinal Glemp, could not fill, the significance of his own attempted assassination on May 13th, Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, and, as he firmly believed, his own deliverance from sudden death by Acre's bullets through the protection of Mary as Our Lady of Fatima. John Paul could not put all those details into a coherent order without coming to the conclusion that the geopolitical timetable was much shorter than he and Cardinal Wyszynski had thought. The, for him, obvious intervention of Mary in preserving his life placed him, in his own eyes, in a direct relationship with Fatima and its third secret. If there was one dominant element in that third secret, it was Russia. The provisos of the third secret made sense only in relation to Russia. He had accepted as fact that John XXIII's decision not to do as the third secret asked, to publish the actual text and to undertake the collegial consecration of Russia to Mary, had placed the Church and therefore the world in the or situation. He had no difficulty accepting the predictions of dire physical and spiritual chastisements, and that Russia would spread its errors throughout every nation. But all of that he had assumed up to that August of 1981 was gridded on a long drawn-out timetable. Now he saw that the geopolitical timetable had been inaccurately calculated. The geopolitical change implied by the third secret was not far off. It was imminent. It was about to take place. Russia was its womb. Russia was its focal point. Russia was to be the main agent of change. Russia was to be the source of a universal blindness and error. So Solidarity was a labor union, the first in a Soviet bloc country. Cardinal Wyszynski had been using them as an instrument of peaceful reform. They had recently started becoming more radical, and Poland's communist government had recently declared martial law to suppress them. Cardinal Wyszynski, Father Martin talks about elsewhere, was instrumental in holding back Soviet oppression of Catholics. John Paul interpreted these events as being part of the secret, though they probably weren't. That means there's something in the secret that you can interpret that way, but I think we'd be stretching ourselves too thin if we tried to go into specifics. All I could say with some degree of certainty is that it probably involves Russian geopolitical activity. His own assassination attempt, obviously he would have connected with the Bishop in White vision, so we understand that one. It's interesting, though, if John Paul really thought that he was the Pope of the vision, then that must mean that the part about the Pope under the control of Satan, which Father Martin said is in the secret, by the way, comes after the chastisement, because surely he didn't think it was himself, and unless it was John the 23rd, it would have to be a pope who came after the events that John Paul thought he was going to live through. It's also possible the secret doesn't specify at all where that would fit into the timetable, and that was just John Paul's interpretation of it. Our final political clue is a little more useful in figuring out what's going to happen. It would come after all the efforts of transnationalists and internationalists, of all the globalists, had come to utter shipwreck because of the malignant geopolitical plans of the party state, which were more efficient, more thoroughly elaborated, and more zealously executed than theirs. There would be general shipwreck because on both sides not the will of the Creator and Redeemer of mankind was the absolute rule of the contenders' efforts, but primarily greed for power and indulgence in mutual fratricide. So Father Martin believed that Russia would inevitably win the East versus West competition, that the New World Order would not actually get established, that they would fail, and that Russia's evil plan would see limited success until the chastisement shut them down. That's definitely his opinion, but it does tell us something definitive. It means that the secret does not contradict this. It does not say that the New World Order or communism will conquer the world. He seemed to confirm that once in an interview.
And Fatima Lucia has even said that communism will eventually take over the whole world. It will be all over the whole world.
Well, no, she didn't say that. What she said was the errors of Marxism.
Oh.
The errors.
He was actually wrong, though. In 1946, in an interview with Thomas Walsh, Lucy did actually say that, in her opinion, communism would conquer the world. The fact that Lucy gave it as her opinion, and that Father Martin disagrees, suggests that the secret really doesn't weigh in on that. Which is interesting, because that means the secret goes into these exact political details, but it doesn't tell us how the situation ends up. Maybe the consecration comes in the middle of that conflict, and the whole thing just dissolves. Lucy's biography reproduces a letter that she wrote to Pius XII in 1958 that weighs in on this. He'd apparently asked her what would be clearer about the secret in 1960, or something to that effect. Since it's before 1960, she says, "I cannot speak of the text." I guess since he wasn't asking her to tell him what it is, and he hadn't chosen to open the envelope early, she wasn't going to volunteer it. So instead she replies that communism will reach its maximum height in 1960. That contradicts the Walsh interview where she thought they would eventually take over the world. But there's 12 years between that interview and this letter, so it's entirely possible that Our Lady told her something that changed her opinion. The historical accuracy of what she said is debatable. 1962 was when the Sino-Soviet split occurred right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which did weaken communism as a global force considerably. It's also interesting, that last line, greed for power and indulgence in mutual fratricide, sounds a lot like hatred and ambition caused a destructive war from Lucy's vision. Those are pretty generic causes for war, though, so it's probably nothing. All told, I think that Father Martin's assessment of how Russia would react to the secret rests on a lot of things that are his own interpretation. But one thing is clear, geopolitics are discussed in the text of the secret, and Russia's role in them is key to the events it describes. The last thing he talked about that might be relevant was the Antichrist. He never said that the Antichrist was mentioned in the third secret, but he did say that the Antichrist is alive. Here's a few quotes.
Is there now, or is there going to be, an Antichrist?
Whether there is now is a question. There is going to be an Antichrist, and I think the best thing we can do is talk about his public appearance.
All right.
Because he may already be in existence. For me to say he is in existence would immediately provoke the questions, where is he and what is he doing?
Yes.
And I want to avoid that.
Yes.
But he will be manifest publicly within a reasonable amount of time. Most people who are 20-something or 30-something will come across Antichrist in their life. I'm 76. I may not.
You said, Father, the Antichrist is alive now.
Yes, he is.
Mortally, as
Yes.
a mortal.
Yes.
Well, now that would indicate to me that in our lifetimes, the Antichrist will mature and will begin his reign.
Well, I'll tell you. Don't ask me to tell you why I say this or why I speak like this. But not necessarily. There has to be a sudden preparation for his debut, for his appearance. It must come to the point that we are humanly without a solution of some grave problem that has arisen, which threatens to wipe us all out, which threatens to liquidate human society as we have known it for 2,000 years, and liquidate all of our culture. We have very little of it left, but we still have a good substantial part of our civilization still standing.
Some crisis that would make us welcome him.
Yes. And we say, my God, you are our Savior. You are God. You must be God. And
Yes,
say,
indeed.
Yes, I am.
Indeed. Well, I don't know what to say about that, except that I guess I'm concerned that it will occur in our lifetimes.
I wish I could say yea or nay to that, Art. I can't.
You said that the Antichrist possibly, or maybe even in your mind, certainly, which I don't know that I have an opinion on it, is already born at this point.
Yes.
I didn't say born. I said already alive.
Already alive.
Yeah. Oh! I'm not saying he's born.
You said he is here now. He is not yet active. I have heard this, that...
He's alive.
The Antichrist is now alive?
And he cannot die until Christ kills him. He has this pseudo-immortality. And don't ask me where, how, who, what.
That's a pretty weird position to take. I'm guessing this was his attempt to rationalize the claim at La Salette that the Antichrist would be born of a nun by 1946. That was part of a conditional prophecy, so you could also use that as an out. Another interesting observation is that Fatima seems to encompass Nostradamus' antichrists. It references the incident of the King of France, whose failure to consecrate France resulted in the rise of Napoleon, the first antichrist of Nostradamus' prophecies. The consecration of Russia was supposed to prevent World War II, led by Hitler, Nostradamus' second antichrist. Could the third antichrist, the antichrist, be set to appear after the chastisement? It's an interesting thought. That leads into my very last point, and this brings us back to Sister Lucy. Frère Michel, in his book The Whole Truth About Fatima, which is like the gold standard in Fatima research, this guy was really good at citing his sources and presenting everything in a level-headed, kind of academic way. He said, "We know from a reliable source that a certain person who was questioning Sister Lucy on the contents of the Final Secret finally obtained this laconic answer. It's in the Gospel and in the Apocalypse. Read them. We even know that one day she indicated chapters 8 to 13. Now, I don't doubt Frère Michel, but I'm not really too sure about this reliable source, especially their ability to remember the exact numbers. We're also not sure if Lucy would have been talking about the spiritual or material chastisements, or both. For example, the great apostasy predicted in Scripture is most likely one of the things she was talking about. But, just for fun, let's go through this. Usually I chuckle when I see people trying to apply the apocalypse to modern events, because people have been doing that forever, and they're always wrong. It's just so vague that you can apply it so many ways. But even if the secret doesn't mention the apocalypse, and even if the secret is not actually a fulfillment of those prophecies, if Lucy felt that the events in 8 through 13 followed the events in the third secret fairly closely, then it's worth our time to examine them and see if we can figure out what she might have been talking about. So, chapter 8 starts out with an angel taking fire from the golden altar in a censer and throwing it on the earth, causing thunderings and voices and lightnings and a great earthquake. Then we begin the 7 trumpets. We're only going to look at the effects of each trumpet, not the given cause of that effect, because there are lots of ways to interpret the causes, but the effects are pretty straightforward. The first trumpet, a third of the earth, trees, and grass are destroyed. The second trumpet, a third of sea life and ships are destroyed. The third trumpet, a third of rivers and fountains are poisoned. The fourth trumpet, a third part of the sun, moon, and stars are darkened, and a third of the day and of the night are darkened. So far we seem to be on target. It starts with a big noisy earthquake, and the first 3 trumpets sound like the kind of aftermath I was envisioning. The darkening of heavenly bodies is a strange one, though. It could be from volcanic ash or dust storms resulting from the massive upheaval of topsoil, or maybe the Earth's rotation ends up slowing down and the days and nights get 1/3 shorter. Or maybe this is a spiritual thing, the heavenly bodies symbolizing church luminaries who no longer shed the light of Christ. That's actually the whole event right there. Everything in the chapters that follows would have to be considered the long-term aftermath. I feel like I should also mention that in Apocalypse 16, the 7th vial causes a great earthquake, such a one as has never been since men were upon the earth, and every island fled away and the mountains were not found. Global earthquakes would be pretty hard to top, so that's probably talking about the same event. Chapter 9, we have trumpet number 5, locusts with human faces and gold crowns that sting with scorpion tails and... Anyway, the effect is ungodly men are tormented for 5 months with some kind of pestilence that makes them wish for death. Maybe it's some kind of non-lethal, humane bioweapon that's meant to disable a nation without damaging resources and infrastructure? Then trumpet number 6, 200 million horsemen that breathe fire and brimstone kill a third of mankind. That could just be some kind of plague, but I tend to look at it as a war. Resources would be scarce in the ruined world, and as I theorized, the military forces of the major world powers could still be intact. The war from Lucy's vision may never have stopped, or it may have resumed after a brief cessation following the event. This would probably be World War III and involve horrible drone armies of death. Maybe that's why the Horsemen are described that way. Chapter 10 is an intermission, at least as far as potential global events are concerned. 11 starts by telling us that the outer court of the temple will be given to the Gentiles, who will tread the holy city underfoot. This could be something like Father Martin believed would happen, where the institutional structure of the Church would be completely usurped by the New World Order and the Pope, who is under the control of Satan. So that would leave only the essential parts of the faithful intact, which is what the text could mean by the temple of God and the altar and them that adore it. Then it speaks of 2 mighty prophets preaching in those days who are killed by the Antichrist, rise again after 3.5 days, and ascend into heaven. The Antichrist hasn't actually been introduced yet, so this may not be in chronological order. There's also another great earthquake, but it only affects the city that they're in. Chapter 12 gives us the 7th and final trumpet, the vision of the woman clothed with the sun, which many have compared to the appearance of Our Lady of Fatima. There are lots of ways to interpret this. Traditionally, the dragon knocking 1/3 of the stars out of heaven symbolizes the great apostasy. I'm not going to speculate on the rest of it. Basically, Satan is cast out of heaven onto earth. He knows he has a short time, so he starts persecuting the church. Then finally, the moment you've all been waiting for. Apocalypse 13, the rise of the beast, aka the Antichrist, and the false prophet, who performs miracles and leads people to worship the Antichrist and to create the living, speaking image of the beast. Maybe an artificial intelligence? He is worshipped as a god, gains power over all nations, one world government, and institutes the mark of the beast system, one world economic system. Those who refuse to worship him are slain, world religion. And that's where Lucy draws the line. If she actually did compare it to Apocalypse, then that's where she said she thinks the secret ends. So what happens next? We already know. Russia will be consecrated, the Immaculate Heart will triumph, and there will be peace. Presumably, if the Antichrist is around, then he dies and that whole Battle of Armageddon thing happens. So, in summary, at an unknown time, but probably within 6 years of either 2017 or 2029 if it parallels the King of France incident, possibly preceded by a supernatural sign in the heavens, either initiating or during a war with Russia, someone will fire a weapon powered by a new source of energy that will, through Russia's instrumentality, whether intentionally or unintentionally, cause global earthquakes strong enough to level mountains, triggering global tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and either massive windstorms or torrential rainfall that will kill at least 600 million people, conservative estimate. Also resulting in parts of continents breaking off and island nations sinking into the ocean, completely annihilating them. Possibly resulting in significant changes to the Earth's axis and rotational velocity. Billions more will die in the aftermath from volcanic ash and gases, nuclear meltdowns, toxic chemical spills, starvation, disease, and eventually chronic degenerative disorders from the environmental toxins. At some point during the aforementioned war, Rome is destroyed and the Bishop in White is executed. The war probably continues after the earthquake event, bringing the death toll to a full third of humanity, or 2.5 billion people as of today. A pope under the control of Satan formally creates a schism, taking for himself the church's wealth and infrastructure and banishing the remnant of the true church to an underground condition, in which they are persecuted by the world in general. And at some point, a pope consecrates Russia in union with all the bishops, Russia is converted and proceeds to save the world, Catholicism becomes the dominant religion, all of the Christian sects are reunited in the true church, and the world enjoys a significant period of peace. The end. That seems to be what the prophecy says, or at least up until the Bishop in White part. The rest of it is kind of a guess based on my reading of Apocalypse, which is probably hilariously wrong. Now, do I think that sounds like something that could realistically happen? No, of course not. That sounds crazy. But it also sounds crazy that 3 shepherd children from the backwaters of Portugal predicted 3 months in advance, to the minute, the sun flying around and changing colors for 10 minutes, then going on to predict World War II and the sign that would signal its beginning, the name of the Pope who would reign when it started, the rise of communism in the Cold War, Vatican II and its aftermath, and probably the current situation with Francis, but I accept the fact that that did indeed happen, and unless I've got something wildly wrong, one of those same children seems to have predicted this doomsday event too. And if you share that belief, then the question is, do you have the courage to face its implications? What am I suggesting that you do? Pretty much be ready to die. I mean, seriously, we have no date for this, we may get no warning sign, and even if we did, where would you go? You can't go underground or into a bunker because of the earthquakes, and you can't stay out in the open because of the windstorms, the volcanoes, and the flooding. Nowhere on land, air, or sea will be unaffected. It's kind of poetic. It's like all of the elements of the earth turn against mankind at once. And even if you could run, you still need access to a priest, right? Kinda limit your bug-out options. Really, the best you could hope to do is to get away from the coast, or any fault lines, or dormant volcanoes, or urban centers, because you know it'll be worse in those areas. Again, the majority of people will survive the initial event, but there's no way to guarantee that you'll be among them. So other than basic prepper stuff like having food and supplies and survival skills, pray and live well. One way or another, life will be over before you know it. Take care, everyone. God bless. So I've got a theory about the third secret of Fatima, and I've never heard another one like it, which is surprising to me because it seems like the most obvious interpretation when you just take all of the source material and put it together. So I thought I'd make a video about it, maybe get some people talking, or at least give you an entertaining doomsday prophecy. I'm not going to go over the basics, so if you're not already familiar with Fatima and the third secret, you might want to go watch something else. Or if you're really curious, I wrote a 200-page report on it. I'll put a link in the description. Or you can use the timestamps in the description to skip to the end of the video for a quick summary of the doomsday part. Okay, so we all know that the third secret has two elements. There's the spiritual chastisement and the material chastisement. The spiritual chastisement was Vatican II, and everything that followed from it. That should be pretty obvious at this point. A lot of people have talked about that. The material chastisement, on the other hand, the annihilation of nations, not a whole lot has been said about that. Really, the only ones who have read the secret and spoken much about it were Lucy herself and Father Malachi Martin. So we're going to just go over what they've said and see what we can glean from it as we go. We'll start with Lucy. Technically her religious name was Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart, but I'm just going to call her Lucy. Now, you may not have heard about this, but back in 2013, the Carmel at Coimbra, the cloister where she lived, released a biography of her written by her fellow sisters called A Pathway Under the Gaze of Mary. You can find it on Amazon, I'll put a link in the description. That included some pages from her autobiography, My Path, otherwise known as her diary. That diary's never been seen before, it's kept at the Carmel and only they have access to it. And one of the entries they included was the story of how she wrote down the third secret. We already knew the basic story. We knew that she was having trouble writing it down and that Our Lady had to give her a special grace in order to be able to do it. But what we didn't know is that when she received that grace, she had a vision, and that vision was clearly of the material chastisement. There is nothing else that it could be. Now, the Carmel has been, let's say, subject to some suspicion by many Fatima scholars, and not without good reason. So you may question the authenticity of this diary entry. But what they usually do is that they downplay the sensational aspects of the apparition. And in fact, they did leave out all the stuff about Lucy fighting to get the consecration done. They even threw in a complete non sequitur right after the vision where they saw a voice saying, "In time, one faith, one baptism, one church, holy, Catholic, apostolic, in eternity, heaven." So when I first read that, I thought, okay, earthquakes and floods, sure. It didn't sound that impressive. I mean, that's really basic wrath of God stuff that you would hear in any prophecy. And I think that's how most people reacted to it, and that's why there hasn't been much talk about it. And I think that might be how it got released in the first place. Maybe whoever was assigned to go through this and remove or avoid the sensational stuff didn't really think about this. Because when you examine it carefully, in the light of everything else we know, it actually narrows down the possibilities for what the third secret could be by a surprising amount. Now, before we begin analyzing it, the first thing we have to decide is whether or not this vision is figurative or literal, and if it's figurative, to what degree. The furthest extreme would be completely abstract symbolism, like, for example, if the axis of the Earth symbolized the ideology on which modern civilization operates, and the earthquakes symbolize social upheaval, and the floods symbolize primordial chaos overtaking the hearts of men. That allegorical, almost artsy kind of interpretation, similar to how the Vatican tried to interpret the vision of the Bishop in White. So how can we determine whether or not this is symbolic? Well, one approach is to look at prophetic visions in Scripture. Has God ever used that kind of wildly abstract language before? And the answer is yes, he has. But it's always really obvious when he does it. The most relevant example I can think of offhand is Daniel 7, the vision of the four beasts. First he sees a lioness with eagle wings, then a bear with 3 rows in its teeth, then a leopard with 4 heads, etc. That's a really obvious example of symbolism. Nobody would interpret that as meaning 4 mutant beasts are going to appear on Earth. And to make it more clear, the angel explains immediately afterwards that each of the beasts symbolizes a kingdom and that their attributes symbolize attributes of those kingdoms. Another example is Apocalypse 12, the dragon who chases the woman and her child around, and the dragon belches out a river and the earth opens up and swallows the river. Again, obviously not a prophecy of a river-belching dragon invading the earth. Lucy's, well, it's true that demons have no physical bodies by nature, they can take visible form even here on Earth. And Gabriel Amorth, the late chief exorcist of Rome, testifies that shadows and beasts are among those that they've been known to use. So ultimately, there's really no way of knowing whether this vision was literal or a representation, but the fact that Lucy thought they would have died of terror had Our Lady not promised that they would go to heaven beforehand, I think lends itself more toward a literal interpretation. The next one is a vision that Jacinta had in the fields. She said, "I saw the Holy Father in a very big house, kneeling by a table, with his head buried in his hands, and he was weeping. Outside the house there were many people, some of them were throwing stones, others were cursing him and using bad language." If this is a pope that's already passed, then this was obviously not literal, unless there was an instance of a pope being stoned by a mob that I'm unaware of. But even if this event hasn't happened yet, it's hard to picture a pope sitting in a big house with an angry mob literally right outside throwing rocks. Not impossible, it just, I think, lends itself more toward a figurative interpretation. In which case it would be an example of simplification. It's taking a complicated political situation and conveying the essence of it briefly in one very easy-to-understand image. Next was the Theophany at Tui, and I'll just put a picture of this up on the screen so I don't have to describe it to you. Basically, Lucy saw this, and she said it was a representation of the mystery of the Holy Trinity, sort of like how Jacob's Ladder represented the relationship between God and men through Christ. Obviously, that has to be symbolic, because the literal reality of it cannot be conveyed in any material way, so that one kind of doesn't count. The last vision, of course, is the Bishop in White. It opens with an angel trying to set the world on fire with a flaming sword, and Our Lady extinguishing the flames with light radiating from her hand. Then the angel cries, "Penance, penance, penance." Now, that could be a thing that literally happens in a metaphysical sense, but it's probably a bit of representative drama meant to show us the dynamic of Our Lady's intercession protecting us from divine punishment. It's not symbolic. We're not saying the fire represents Hitler and the light represents the Allied forces or anything crazy like that. It means what it shows. It's just not necessarily something that literally happens the way we're seeing it. After that, we have the Bishop in White walking through a ruined city, stepping over corpses with trembling steps and a look of pain. Climbing a steep mountain with vision, on the other hand, can easily be taken literally. And yes, there are parts of Apocalypse that you could interpret literally, but the book establishes its abstract motif early on. Moreover, while the scriptural visions were given to the Church to meditate on for millennia, Lucy's vision, unlike the third secret text, was not intended for the public. It was just something for her to give her strength to write down the secret that very night. So you would think she understood what she was seeing, and that's probably the very reason that Our Lady doesn't explain it, because it was a clear visual depiction of what she had already been told in the third secret. But there's a less abstract kind of figurative language, let's call it representation or simplification. Say you wanted to visually convey something that isn't visible, like magnetism. You could show it by its literal effects, but that wouldn't convey what's actually causing those effects. So instead you could do, maybe like on a TV show, you could see little wavy lines representing the magnetic fields. Or if you wanted to show something complicated, say like a series of political events leading up to a war, you could simplify that and just show two world leaders yelling at each other in some kind of visual exchange, maybe standing over a map. I mean, that's not wildly abstract, but it is symbolic. You follow me? So I can't think of any scriptural examples offhand that do that. So let's approach this from another angle then. What about the other visions of Fatima? Did any of them use figurative language? The first one was the vision of hell. You may remember Our Lady shone light on the ground, and it opened up, and the children saw hell, and they saw it as a sea of fire with flaming souls, like transparent embers, all blackened and burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration. Now some might say that this has to be symbolic because hell is not a physical place with fire and brimstone, to which I would reply you need a refresher on your catechism because hell is totally a physical place. We don't know where exactly. People have come up with various theories over the centuries, the center of the Earth or another dimension or Mars. But wherever it is, we know that it's a physical place because, at the end of time, everyone will be raised from the dead, and the damned will take their bodies with them back to hell to be tormented physically as well as spiritually, and if physical bodies can exist there, then it must be a physical place. The only other element of the vision that one might object to as being symbolic was the depiction of demons with the likeness of animals, black and transparent like burning coals. Suddenly start talking about how the third secret has been totally released, and Lucy said so, and they even bring up that fake interview that Cardinal Bertone did, which Bertone himself discredited live on national television back in 2007.
Che è larga 9 centimetri, come hanno scritto diversi autori.
Yet at the same time on the page before, they have a footnote that actually points out that the Bertone interview disagrees with the diary entry they just showed, where the Mother of God explicitly tells Lucy to write 1960 on the front of the envelope. They don't draw any conclusions from it. They don't say that it discredits the Bertoni interview or try to give some kind of hand-wavy explanation as to why they disagree. It just points it out. So it seems like there's conflicting forces at work here. Like they know they have to toe the party line, but they're still trying to subtly get the truth out. The fact that an official Fatima publication would include a vision like this at all is already at odds with their usual MO, which might lead you to suspect that this is a fake vision and they're trying to mislead people for some reason. But if that was the case, I would expect it to be more sensational, or at least more detailed. Fortunately for us, they anticipated this, and they included a scan of the original Portuguese handwritten diary entry. This is, I think, one of 2 diary pages in the entire book that they bothered scanning. So clearly somebody understood what they were sitting on here, and wanted to share it in a way that was verifiable. If they were going to fabricate a vision, they would not have volunteered this scan, because they know that we have done forensic analysis of Lucy's handwriting before, looking for those very kind of shenanigans. So as far as I'm concerned, this is totally canon. This is word of God when it comes to Fatima analysis now. So let's get right into it. This is her description of the vision she had January 3rd, 1944. Let's cue some music. The tip of the spear as a flame unlatches and touches the axis of the earth. It shudders. Mountains, cities, towns, and villages with their inhabitants are buried. The sea, the rivers, and the clouds emerge from their limits, overflowing and bringing with them in a whirlwind houses and people in numbers that are not possible to count. It is the purification of the world because of sin as it plunges. Hatred and ambition cause the destructive war. Then I felt the rapid beating of my heart, and in my mind the echo of a gentle